Dean Martin was driving through the wrong part of Los Angeles at 2:30 a.m. when he heard the music that would change his life forever. It was coming from a basement somewhere on Central Avenue, a melody so pure and heartbreaking that Dean pulled his Cadillac over to the curb and sat in the darkness, listening. Jazz. Real jazz. Not the sanitized version they played in the white clubs, but the raw, honest sound that came from people who had something to say and nowhere else to say it except through their instruments. Dean followed the sound down a narrow alley between two abandoned buildings. The music was coming from below ground, through a heavy wooden door marked only with the number 88. He knocked. A small window slid open. Eyes studied him suspiciously. "We're closed," a voice said. "I'm not looking for a drink," Dean said. "I'm looking for the music." The window closed. Dean heard muffled conversation, then the sound of multiple locks being undone. The door opened to reveal a tall, thin, black man in his 60s, wearing a worn suit and a cautious expression. "You lost, Mr. Martin." Dean was surprised the man knew who he was. "Maybe, but I found something I didn't know I was looking for." The man studied him for a long moment, then stepped aside. "Name's Moses Washington. This is my place, or what's left of it." Dean followed Moses down a steep staircase into a basement that had been converted into a makeshift jazz club. 30 or 40 people sat at small tables, listening to a quartet on a tiny stage. The music was extraordinary. A trumpet player who made his instrument weep, a piano player whose fingers moved like liquid poetry, a bass that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the city itself. But the room was falling apart. Water stains on the ceiling, chairs held together with tape, a piano that was missing half its keys. This wasn't a club, it was a refuge, a place where musicians came to play real music, not the commercial stuff that paid the bills. "How long have you been running this place?" Dean asked quietly. 15 years, Moses said. "Ever since they stopped letting us play in the white clubs downtown. Used to have a real venue upstairs, but the city shut us down. Said we were a fire hazard. Truth is, we were playing too good for them to ignore." Dean listened to the music and felt something he hadn't felt in years. This wasn't entertainment. This was art. This was truth. This was everything he'd gotten into music to find, and had somehow lost along the way. "Who are these musicians?" Dean asked. "Best players in the city," Moses said with pride. "Maybe in the country. They just don't get to play where anyone important can hear them." The trumpet player finished his solo, and the room erupted in appreciation. Not polite applause, but genuine recognition of something beautiful. Dean found himself clapping harder than he had in any venue he'd ever performed in. "You mind if I ask what brings you here, Mr. Martin?" Moses said. "This isn't exactly your neighborhood." Dean was quiet for a moment. How could he explain that he'd been driving aimlessly through the city, feeling empty despite all his success? How could he tell this man that he'd been looking for something real in a world that felt increasingly artificial? "I was lost," Dean said finally, "but I think I just found my way." Dean stayed until sunrise, listening to music that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with performing in the first place. When he finally left, he pressed a $100 bill into Moses's hand. "For the musicians," Dean said. Moses looked at the money in surprise. "Mr. Martin, this is too much." "It's not enough," Dean said, "but it's a start." Dean drove home as the sun came up over Los Angeles, but he couldn't stop thinking about what he'd seen. The talent, the passion, the complete lack of resources. These musicians were creating magic with instruments held together by hope and determination, while Dean performed with full orchestras and every advantage money could buy. Over the next few days, Dean found himself researching the Central Avenue jazz scene. What he discovered made him angry. Dozens of incredible musicians were working day jobs, playing restaurants and wedding receptions, unable to get bookings in the major venues because of the color of their skin. Meanwhile, white musicians with half the talent were headlining the Sunset strip clubs, making thousands of dollars for performances that couldn't touch what Dean had heard in that basement. It was 1954. Segregation was still legal in much of the country, and even in Los Angeles, the entertainment industry was divided along clear racial lines. Black musicians played for black audiences, white musicians played for white audiences, and never the two shall meet. But Dean Martin had never been good at following rules he didn't believe in. The idea came to him gradually. What if someone were to quietly fund a real venue for these musicians? Not a charity case, but a legitimate club where they could play their music for audiences who appreciated it? What if someone with connections in the industry could help these artists get the recognition they deserved? What if Dean Martin became that someone? The problem was that any involvement by a major white entertainer would draw attention. The press would make it a story about Dean Martin being charitable to black musicians, which would both patronize the artists and potentially destroy Dean's career. In 1954, crossing racial lines in entertainment was career suicide. So Dean decided to do it secretly. He began by approaching Moses Washington with a proposal. Dean would provide the funding to turn the basement club into a real venue. Proper sound equipment, decent furniture, a piano that worked. In exchange, Moses would run the club as he saw fit, booking the musicians he thought deserved to be heard. "Why would you do this?" Moses asked suspiciously. "What's in it for you?" "The music," Dean said simply. "I want to keep hearing the music." "And if word gets out? If people find out Dean Martin is funding a black jazz club?" Dean had thought about this. "Then I guess we'll deal with that when it happens." Moses studied him carefully. "You could lose everything." "I could," Dean agreed, "but these musicians are losing everything every day just by being born the wrong color. Seems like it's my turn to take a risk." The renovation began quietly. Dean arranged for equipment to be delivered at night. He hired contractors who didn't ask questions and paid them enough to keep quiet. Slowly, the basement was transformed into a proper jazz club. But Dean didn't stop there. He began using his industry connections to help the musicians in ways they never knew about. When a record producer was looking for a saxophone player, Dean would happen to mention the incredible talent he'd heard about on Central Avenue. When a film needed a soundtrack, Dean would suggest checking out some of the undiscovered musicians in the underground scene. He never mentioned names, never claimed credit, never even hinted at his involvement. But opportunities began to appear for musicians who had been ignored for years. The club, now called The Note, became legendary among jazz aficionados. Word spread quietly through the black community, and then to white jazz fans who were willing to cross racial lines for authentic music. Soon, musicians from New York and Chicago were making pilgrimages to Los Angeles just to play at this little basement club where the music was pure and the audiences understood what they were hearing. Dean became a regular, showing up late at night after his own performances, sitting in the back corner and listening. He never asked to perform, never tried to make it about himself. He was just another face in the crowd, albeit one who happened to be funding the entire operation. The musicians knew someone was helping them, but Moses kept Dean's identity secret. They called their anonymous benefactor Mr. Lucky, the man who had somehow made their dreams possible. "Whoever Mr. Lucky is," the trumpet player told Moses one night, "he's got the soul of a true musician. He understands what we're trying to do here." Dean heard this secondhand from Moses and smiled. It was the greatest compliment he'd ever received. But maintaining the secret became increasingly difficult as the Note's reputation grew. Music critics began writing about the incredible talent emerging from Central Avenue. Record executives started showing up. Even some mainstream performers began talking about this mysterious club where you could hear real jazz. The breaking point came in 1958 when a young musician named Marcus Johnson landed a recording contract after being discovered at the Note. Marcus was a piano player whose style was revolutionary. He could play classical, jazz, blues, and something entirely new, all in the same song. The story hit the entertainment press. Unknown musician gets $1 million deal after underground performance. Reporters began investigating the note, trying to figure out how an abandoned basement had become the most important jazz venue on the West Coast. Dean watched the coverage with growing anxiety. It was only a matter of time before someone connected him to the club. And when that happened, both he and the musicians would pay the price. His worst fears were realized when a gossip columnist named Harold Winchell, known for his vicious attacks on celebrities who crossed social boundaries, began sniffing around the story. Winchell's investigation was thorough and ruthless. He traced the equipment purchases, interviewed contractors, and eventually discovered that all the funding for the note came from a shell company owned by Dean Martin. The night before Winchell's story was scheduled to run, Dean received a phone call. "Mr. Martin, this is Harold Winchell. I think we should talk." Dean's blood ran cold. "What about?" "About your little charity project on Central Avenue. About how America's coolest white entertainer has been secretly funding a Negro jazz club. About how this story is going to destroy your career when I print it tomorrow." Dean was quiet for a long moment. "What do you want?" "Smart man. I want an exclusive interview. I want you to admit what you've been doing and explain why. I want you to give me the story voluntarily, or I'll write it without your cooperation. Either way, it's coming out." "And if I give you the interview? Then maybe I write it as a human interest story instead of a scandal. Maybe you come out looking like a hero instead of a race-mixing troublemaker." Dean knew he was trapped, but he also knew that his response would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of the note and all the musicians who depended on it. "I'll do the interview," Dean said, "but I have conditions." "You're not in a position to make conditions." "Actually, I am. Because without my cooperation, all you have is a story about me giving money to a club. With my cooperation, you have a story about why I did it, about the music, about the talent, about what this really means." Winchell was silent, considering. "The musicians don't get hurt," Dean continued. "The club doesn't get shut down. And you print the truth about what's happening there, that it's not charity, it's recognizing talent that's been ignored. And if I don't agree, then I don't give you the interview. I don't confirm anything. And your story is just gossip without substance." The interview ran the following Sunday. The headline read, "Dean Martin's Secret, the King of Cool's Hidden Passion for Jazz." Winchell had kept his word. The story wasn't a scandal. It was a revelation. Dean talked about hearing the music that night in 1954, about recognizing talent that wasn't getting the recognition it deserved, about believing that great music transcended race, and that true artists deserved to be heard regardless of the color of their skin. "I'm not a civil rights activist," Dean was quoted as saying. "I'm just a guy who loves music, and when I hear something beautiful, I want to make sure other people can hear it too." The reaction was mixed. Some praised Dean for his courage and vision. Others criticized him for crossing racial lines. Some venues canceled bookings. Some radio stations stopped playing his records. But something unexpected happened. The story brought national attention to the note and the musicians who played there. Record executives from New York flew to Los Angeles to hear what Dean Martin had been supporting. Television producers wanted to film the club. Magazine writers wanted to profile the artists. Marcus Johnson, the piano player who had gotten the recording contract, released an album that went to #1 on the jazz charts. The trumpet player Dean had first heard that night in 1954 was offered a spot in a major orchestra. Other musicians from the note began getting opportunities they had only dreamed about. "You did this," Moses told Dean one night as they watched a packed house listening to extraordinary music. "You made this possible." "They made it possible," Dean said, gesturing to the musicians on stage. "I just helped people find them." The note continued to operate for another decade, launching the careers of dozens of musicians who might otherwise have remained unknown. Dean continued to support it financially, but he never again hid his involvement. He became a regular, sometimes sitting in with the musicians, always respecting that this was their space, their music, their time to shine. Years later, when Marcus Johnson won a Grammy for his revolutionary album Notes from the Underground, he dedicated the award to Mr. Lucky, who believed in the music before anyone else did. Dean was in the audience that night. When the camera found him in the crowd, he simply smiled and applauded. He had never asked for recognition, and he didn't need it now, because the real reward was the music. The knowledge that dozens of careers had been launched, that thousands of people had heard performances they would remember for the rest of their lives, that art had triumphed over prejudice in at least one small corner of the world. Dean Martin had started out looking for something real in an artificial world. What he found was a way to help other people's reality reach the world that needed to hear it. The Basement Club on Central Avenue became a landmark. A plaque was eventually installed reading, "The Note, Where Great Music Found Its Voice, 1954-1968. Dean never told the story of how it all began, never claimed credit for the careers that were launched or the barriers that were broken. He just continued to show up, to listen, to support great music wherever he found it. Because sometimes the coolest thing you can do is use your privilege to amplify someone else's voice. Sometimes the most important performance is the one where you don't perform at all, and sometimes the best way to find yourself is to help someone else find their audience." The music played on, and Dean Martin, sitting in the back corner of a basement club at 2 a.m., listening to jazz that could make angels weep, had never felt more at home. In the end, that was his greatest performance. Not the songs he sang, but the songs he helped others sing. Not the stages he commanded, but the stage he helped build for people who needed a place to share their gifts with the world. The king of cool had become something even better, a man who understood that true coolness meant lifting others up, not just standing above them. And every note played at the Note was proof that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most unexpected places. All it takes is someone willing to listen, and someone brave enough to help the world hear what they've discovered. Dean Martin had found his rhythm at last, and it was perfect.